As we continue in our study of the Temple Sermon, chapters 7 and 8, the book of Jeremiah, we continue looking at Israel's rebellion, its dependence upon the temple, and I want to take a brief look at the history of Israel's idolatry that led to this point of eventual destruction that would come in the life of Judah, Jerusalem, the kings of Israel, and the impact upon the life of Jeremiah the prophet. The amazing thing is, through it all, God would, as he promised in the call, chapter 1, God would sustain him and he would deliver him through the most difficult of circumstances. So again, in chapter 7 and on to the first few verses of chapter 8, the so-called Temple Sermon, calling for the people to obey God's revelation, the covenant stipulations of faithfulness to him, to worshiping him only rather than the gods of the nations, to live just and righteous lives, how they relate to people on every level of the society in that day. And the people of the upper echelon had become abusive of the poor. And so Jeremiah continues then in this part 2 of the Temple Sermon, our unit 8. I want to just highlight some of the aspects of Ishtar and the Queen of Heaven. She is first mentioned in verse 18 as the example of how the family worked together as the children gather wood, fathers kindle the fire, mothers bake the cakes for the Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven is the epithet of Ishtar. She was the patron consort of Marduk of Babylon, or even of Ashur, the patron chief god of the Assyrians. And they were worshiping the whole family, bringing sacrifices, which of course angering God, and that which would eventually bring their judgment. Though they would bring their multiple offerings, he would say, beginning in verse 21, these were not what God would require. They would bring those offerings, but they were useless. They were abomination, as Isaiah says in chapter 1. They were abomination to God if not brought out of a right heart and out of a life of obedience and faithfulness to him. So, he speaks the words to the people, but again, they are unresponsive. And so he says, days are coming, said the Lord, will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of the sons of Hinnom, the area where they sacrificed children to the gods of the Assyrians or Babylonians, or to Milcom, the god of the Ammonites. Instead, the place would not be simply the place of the death of children, but the death of the people of Judah and Jerusalem because of their rejection. So he says, I will make to cease from the cities of Judah, verse 34, and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, for the land will become a ruin. And at that time they will bring forth the bones of the kings of Judah, and the bones of the princes, bones of the priests, and the bones of the prophets, and the bones of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, back to, as Jeremiah has done from the beginning, dressing down every level of Israelite society, because they had abandoned God, and thus the bones of all of them would be desecrated, would be spread out in the sun, to the sun, the moon, and all the host of heaven, all of the deities of the astral world of the sun, stars, the moon, that they have been serving, which they've gone after and which they have sought. And then they will be gathered and buried. So again, judgment of the worst of the kind of that day. The worship of other gods, of course, we read through the history of Israel, is a fascinating study. We read about it, of course, as a warning at the end of the book of Joshua. The book of Judges is really fashioned around the cycles of Israel's unfaithfulness, exemplified by the worshiping of other gods. God would raise up as the people then, after going through years of oppression, repent. God delivers them from oppression, and then they go back through the cycle again after years of peace. The book of Kings continues that same cyclical theme of Israel's unfaithfulness. The startling aspect of this is, in the Kings material, is that the greatest of the kings internationally, the wisest of the kings, Solomon, was also the one who began the downward spiral of idolatry. The book of Kings is fascinatingly woven around the theme of Israel's unfaithfulness, explaining why they go into exile, and of course, as that theme is exemplified throughout the Kings material, explaining why the kingdom fell due to their unfaithfulness to the covenant, their idolatry. Jeremiah and Kings both used the material that the Israelites were worshiping on every high hill and under every green tree. So on the hills to the valleys, everywhere throughout the land, the use of what we call in literary terminology, merismus, the depiction of the whole by the bookends, like the heavens and the earth. High hill, under every green tree, which means down in the valleys. The worship of idols was ubiquitous throughout the land. In the end of the Solomon material, 1 Kings 11:1 begins with the ominous words that Solomon loved many foreign women. We're told about his many wives, whom the Lord had said, again, go all the way back to Deuteronomy, the warnings to the kings, Deuteronomy 17, among many things, not to have many wives or concubines. Solomon had many. It warns against issues of the depending upon military rather than depending upon God, but of course also the warning against idolatry, because in Solomon's case, as the Lord had warned, that the incorporation of so many foreigners into the household, into the harems of Solomon's palace, would lead to idolatry, and that's what happened in the history of Israel. So again, we have this struggle from the judge material to the Samuel. Samuel begins, of course, with the abuse of the ark, symbol of God's presence, would lead to its capture. Of course, eventually God vindicates himself through carrying out the judgment against the Philistines. But in the backdrop of that, Israel will call for a king. They wanted a king like the nations, and the problem of Israel is that they wanted to be like the nations in terms of power, in terms of leadership, economic prosperity, and so forth, but that was not God's original design for his people. So the Kings relates all of that, and then the prophets emphasize the key issues of broken covenant and idolatry and the coming judgment of the exile. And those Solomon's kings stretch from the river of Egypt, which is the Wadi el-Arish, all the way to the Euphrates, fulfilling the Abrahamic promise of the land from Egypt to Mesopotamia. 2 Chronicles 9:26, it's also echoed in the King's material, ruled over an extensive empire from the border of Egypt to the border of the nations of Mesopotamia. A great, great kingdom that eventually, as a result of that which began with Solomon, would lead to their eventual destruction as a result of the idolatry. There's one level at which it begins with the split of the kingdom. Again, with Solomon's idolatry, he is warned about the split of the kingdom and about the collapse of the kingdom. So in the end of chapter 11, the kingdom begins to fall apart. You have rebellion of peoples that David had conquered. We have, of course, then the leadership of Jeroboam, who had been originally a faithful administrator under Solomon, but who contended with Solomon and escaped to Egypt, comes back to lead the northern kingdom. And when he does so, he sets up alternative worship centers, the famous golden calves at Bethel in the south and Dan in the north, and then also established alternative festivals, such as the Sukkot festival in the 8th month rather than the 7th month, and so provided alternatives. So when we look at Tel Dan here in the PowerPoint, we know about the worship that went on there in the setting for the golden calf and Israelite worship in the northern part of the northern kingdom, that which was excavated in the 1970s and 80s under Avram Biran at Tel Dan. So just a few pictures here of the setting of the horned altar where the large sacrifices would take place, where the blood of the sacrifices would be poured out. And the backdrop on the right-hand side is the area of the Holy of Holies, where the golden calf would have probably stood on a pedestal. We have examples of these bull calves from various excavated sites and worship centers that have been found in the surveys of the northern kingdom. And this is simply one, a bronze bull from the region near the city of Samaria, where northern kingdom idolatry existed. Another stage after the syncretistic worship at Dan and Bethel, we read about the syncretism that's exemplified through several ostraca, that is, inscriptions on pottery. This particular inscription, found in the Negev at a site called Untitled Chapter, depicts deities looking like Egyptian and Mesopotamian deities, with an interesting inscription kind of at the top of this panel that, again, this map describes the location of Untitled Chapter, just to the south of Kadesh Barnea, which is the Kusema site there on the map along the Wadi El Arish. But the inscription reads that I adjure you, I implore you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. So this concept of religious syncretism, they had imported the Asherah consort of Canaanite religion into the worship of Yahweh and said you have. So now Yahweh has a wife in this popular religion of ancient Israel. There's another location called Kibbutz al-Qom in which we have a similar inscription describing this level of religious syncretism. The next stage of idolatry is in the northern kingdom when Omri and Ahab rule, when under Ahab and his relationship to Jezebel, the daughter of the priest king of the Sidon, Tyre area, Ethbaal, that at this site, here we're looking at an aerial view of the palaces of Omri and Ahab, excavated back in the period first before World War I, between World War I and World War II, and then later on in the 1950s and 60s. It was expanded. But out of the text of Kings, we read that under Ahab, the sinfulness of the northern kingdom became even more than that which was before. So the building of a temple to Baal in the newly built city, the new capital city of Samaria, was tantamount to a religious and political statement that now Baal worship, with the building of this temple, had become the official state religion of the northern kingdom under Ahab and Jezebel. And so very important pivotal point. And then that's why when you move over into chapter 17, verse 1, why the circumstances by which God raises up Elijah the prophet to confront Israel's worship of Baal, believed in the Canaanite religion to be the provider of the rains. He is pictured in the Canaanite literature as the rider of the clouds, an image used of Yahweh in the hymns of the Old Testament. But Baal had become now the official chief deity of the northern kingdom, accompanied by Asherah in that level of syncretism worship that had existed before. And there's an interesting excursus or side note at the end of 1 Kings chapter 16. That during the reign of Omri and Ahab, Hiel, a fellow from Bethel, went down and rebuilt Jericho. Now remember, of course, according to Joshua, Jericho was accursed and never to be rebuilt. But Hiel went down and started rebuilding the city of Jericho, the accursed city. And in this translation, at the cost of Seguv, his youngest, he set up its gates, according to the word of the Lord spoken through Joshua. So, the firstborn, Aviram, he laid its foundations, and the cost of Seguv, his youngest, he set up its gates. So I want to take you to our excavation that we finished up last year at Tel Gezer in dealing with the Canaanite city of Gezer from the Bronze Ages. So this concept of sacrifice, and this is highlighted in a number of commentaries on the king's material, where this phrase cost of meant that his sons became dedicatory sacrifices, the sacrificing of children as foundation deposits in the building of this new city. So here's an aerial photo, a distant photo of our Middle Bronze Age Canaanite gate at the city of Gezer. And I want to highlight an area as we'll move closer into the gate area. Notice that we're looking through the portals. There are three gate portals as you run through the gate building. Now remember, the gate is a building complex. It's like going through, major security, but in three different phases to get into the interior of the city. But you'll notice down across the picture that there are three holes in the foundation of the gate building at Canaanite Gezer. So here you're looking across, as you can see in the left-hand picture, one on the immediate right, one just to the left of center, and then one down to lower left of that. There are three different jar burials of children that were probably sacrificed as dedications to the gods of Canaanite Gezer back in the Bronze Ages of the history of the city, when this city reached its peak of economic and international acclaim, prosperity, when actually the era in which Canaanites dominated Egypt, the so-called Hyksos period. And so in our excavations, as we open up this area on the interior of the city, on the face of the gate, the foundation deposits of the gate, at least, as we uncovered, 3 children were sacrificed as foundation deposits for the building. So, again, that leads up to God's raising up Elijah to confront this new level of Israel's idolatry and degradation influencing the nation at this pivotal point in Israel's history. All of this, of course, led up to the continued cycle of idolatry that led to, as we're seeing in Jeremiah, the eventual destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. The temple of the Lord, place of his name, would not continue to be abused by the people. God cannot be used for our intents.